The rain had been falling since morning, soft at first, then heavier as the day dragged on. It wasn't the kind of storm that demanded attention, just a steady whisper against the roof that made the world outside seem far away. I curled up in my grandmother's old armchair by the living room window, watching droplets slide down the glass in crooked paths. It had been months since I moved into her house. Months since I discovered the box of unsent love letters hidden in the attic. I had read them once, maybe twice, then tucked them away again. They were beautiful and sad, like a melody that ended before the last note could be played. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I hadn't been able to let them go, or share them with anyone, not even Alpha. I might have drifted off if not for the soft thud from the front door. Mail. Probably bills or another stack of flyers I'd throw away without a glance. But when I bent to pick up the pile, one envelope stood out. It was different, thicker, the paper slightly yellowed, as though it had been waiting years to be opened. My grandmother's old post office box number was scribbled in the top corner, but the address was mine, forwarded. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar, with a certain deliberate tilt that made my chest tighten. For a moment I just held it in my hands, the weight of it strange, almost intentional. Like whoever sent it knew it would eventually reach me. I slipped a finger under the flap and tore it open carefully. Inside was a single sheet of folded paper. The ink was a little faded, but the handwriting was bold, confident. I knew your grandmother, and I knew the man in the letters you found. If you want the truth, meet me. But understand, once you do, you will never see her story the same way again. My breath caught. The letters, the ones no one knew about. How could she possibly know? The note ended with a date, a time, and an address. No name, no return address. Just an invitation, or maybe a warning. You look like you've just seen a ghost. I jumped at the sound of Alpha's voice. He was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, his dark eyes studying me with that mix of calm and alertness I had come to know well. I folded the letter quickly, maybe too quickly, and tried to keep my voice even. It's nothing, I said. He stepped closer, the faint scent of rain clinging to him. Lily, I've known you long enough to know when something's not nothing. For a heartbeat, I thought about telling him everything, the box of letters, the note in my hand, the address scribbled at the bottom. But instead, I just smiled faintly and said, "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicate it," he said gently. I couldn't, not yet, because somehow I knew that once I told him, the story would no longer be mine alone to carry. The letter sat on the kitchen counter like it was daring me to open it again. I'd read it 3 times already, but the words still felt unreal, like they were written for someone else. I made tea I didn't drink, paced from one end of the kitchen to the other, and kept glancing at the clock as if the ticking might offer advice. It didn't. Alpha was still in the living room, flipping through one of my grandmother's old photo albums. He had a way of moving around the house like he belonged there, which sometimes made me forget that we were still figuring each other out. But tonight, the air between us felt different, charged somehow. I could feel his questions even when he wasn't asking them. "Lily," he called softly, without looking up. "You're thinking too hard." I leaned against the doorway, tea mug in hand. "Maybe I just have a lot to think about." He finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "And you're not planning to share?" I hesitated. "It's not that I don't want to, I don't know how." He closed the album slowly. "You're talking like whatever's on your mind could change something between us." I didn't answer, and maybe that was answer enough, because he gave a small, knowing nod. I tried to bridge the gap between honesty and self-protection. When I was cleaning out the attic months ago, I found something of my grandmother's, something personal. "Like?" he asked. "Letters," I said carefully. "Old ones. from someone she cared about. His brow lifted. A love story? I smiled faintly. More like a half-finished one. He waited, but I didn't go further. I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood what the note really meant. Alpha leaned back on the couch, studying me for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not here to pry, Lily. I'm here because I like you, and if there's something you need to figure out before you let me in, I can live with that. For a while." His words warmed me more than the tea in my hands. It wasn't a demand, it wasn't a test. It was trust. And somehow, that made it harder to keep the secret. Later, after Alpha left for the night, I stood in the kitchen again, staring at the folded paper. The rain had stopped, but the house still felt damp with its memory. The address at the bottom of the note seemed to pulse under the dim light. A date and time. 3 days from now. I traced the letters with my fingertip, then tucked it back into its envelope. I had no idea what I'd find when I went. But I knew this much. Whatever it was, Alpha would have to be part of it. The morning of the meeting came wrapped in fog. The air outside was thick and silver, and my breath hung in front of me as I walked to the car. I had told Alpha only that I had somewhere to be. He had looked at me a little too long before nodding, but he didn't ask where. That trust of his, it was starting to feel heavy in my chest. The address led me to a quiet street lined with old brick houses. The one I was looking for had a small garden out front, the kind that seemed tended more out of love than obligation. I knocked, my pulse quickening with each second of silence that followed. Finally, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 70s. She had sharp eyes, the kind that looked straight through you. Her silver hair was pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder, and she wore a cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender. "You're Lily," she said, not asking but stating. "Yes. Come in, we have much to talk about." The living room was small but warm, filled with the scent of tea and old books. I noticed a photograph on the mantel, my grandmother younger, laughing at something just out of frame. The woman caught me looking. "That was taken the summer she met him," she said. "Him?" I asked, my voice tight. She nodded slowly. "The man in your letters. His name was Michael." She poured tea for both of us and began to speak, her words like pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I'd been building. "Your grandmother and Michael were complicated," she said. "They loved each other, but life didn't give them the chance to be together. There were reasons. Some I can tell you, some I can't." I leaned forward. "Then why write to me now?" "Because you deserve to know that love stories don't always end the way we expect. And because—" She paused, her gaze locking with mine. "Michael is still alive." The room tilted slightly, as if her words had knocked the air out of it. "Alive?" I whispered. "Yes, and he knows about you." I gripped the teacup tighter. My grandmother had been gone for years. What could he possibly know about me? The woman smiled faintly, as if she already knew the question swirling in my mind. "You'll have to ask him yourself." She slid a slip of paper across the table, a phone number written in a careful hand. That evening, Alpha noticed something had shifted in me. "You look like you've been somewhere far away," he said gently. I hesitated, the paper with Michael's number burning in my pocket. "I have. Want to talk about it?" "Not yet," I said. "But soon." And even though I didn't say the words out loud, I felt the truth of them. When I tell you, everything will change. Alpha starts noticing that I've been quieter since the meeting. He doesn't push at first, but his eyes linger longer when I drift off mid-sentence, and I catch him glancing at my phone as if wondering who I'm thinking about. One evening, while we're having coffee, he asks, "Are you sure everything's okay?" I almost tell him about Michael, but the words feel too heavy in my throat. Instead, I say, "It's just family stuff." His frown says he doesn't fully believe me. I sit on my bed one night, the slip of paper with Michael's number in my hand. My thumb hovers over my phone, but I can't bring myself to dial. I imagine his voice, imagine the decades between him and my grandmother collapsing in a single moment, and I freeze. The next day, Alpha opens up about a time he almost lost someone he loved because he didn't speak the truth soon enough. His voice is quiet, and his gaze is somewhere far away. It makes my chest ache, but it also makes me wonder, am I doing the same thing to him now? We start having small misunderstandings, not arguments exactly, but moments where I feel him pulling back, and I don't know how to pull him forward again. A walk in the park feels shorter than usual. Laughter comes less easily. One night, lying in bed, I know I can't keep Michael a secret forever. I don't know if Alpha will understand, or if it will change everything between us, but the truth is coming, and when it does, I can only hope it won't be too late. The days after my meeting with the woman passed like a haze I couldn't shake off. I moved through them like I was half awake, my mind replaying her words, the note, and the shadowy shape of Michael's name. Alpha noticed. He always noticed. At first he didn't say anything, just studied me quietly when I'd trail off mid-sentence or stare out the window longer than usual. But I could feel his curiosity growing, like a storm forming far out at sea. One evening, we were in the small cafe around the corner, sharing a slice of warm apple pie. Alpha set his fork down, watching me over the rim of his coffee cup. "Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked. The truth sat heavy in my throat. I wanted to tell him about Michael, about the letter, about how I'd been holding on to a piece of my grandmother's past like it was my own heart. But the words didn't come. "It's just family stuff," I said instead, my voice thin. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment I thought he'd push. But he simply nodded, though the faint line between his brows didn't fade. That night, I sat cross-legged on my bed, staring at the slip of paper with Michael's number written in looping script. My phone lay beside me, the screen dark, waiting. All I had to do was type the number. All I had to do was press the green button. But every time I pictured it, his voice on the other end, the sudden bridge between past and present, I froze. I told myself I needed more time. I told myself I wasn't ready. The next day, Alpha and I walked along the river. The water was calm, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Out of nowhere, he started talking about the time he almost lost someone he loved because he hadn't spoken the truth soon enough. His voice was low, like the memory itself hurt to touch. "It's strange," he said, "how we think we have all the time in the world to say what matters, until we don't." I looked at him then, really looked, and wondered if I was doing the same thing to him now. Over the next week, small cracks began to show. Not arguments, but moments that felt thinner. A joke I made fell flat. A walk in the park ended sooner than usual. The warmth between us flickered, just for a heartbeat, and I hated the feeling. One night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadow stretching long across the room. I knew I couldn't keep this secret forever. Sooner or later, Alpha would need to know. The thought terrified me, not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't know what the truth would do to us. And yet, deep down, I could feel it. The moment was coming. The truth was coming. I kept the scrap of paper with Michael's number tucked inside the back cover of a book I rarely opened. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it wasn't somewhere Alpha would stumble across unless he was looking for it. Days passed, but my mind kept circling back to it. I'd be in the middle of stirring a pot of soup or folding laundry, and the thought would slide in. You should just call him. Just once. But every time I imagined hearing his voice, I froze. What if he didn't want to talk to me? What if he didn't even remember my grandmother? Or worse, what if he remembered too much? It was a Tuesday evening when I finally sat on my bed, phone in hand, the rain tapping gently against the window. I scrolled to the number I had saved under M and hovered over the call button. My thumb shook, but not from the cold. I took a deep breath and pressed it. 1 ring, 2, 3. A voice answered, deep and cautious. Hello? I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely hear. Hello? He said again. I panicked. Sorry, wrong number, I blurted and hung up before I could stop myself. I stared at the phone in my hand, shame burning in my chest. Pathetic, Lily. Absolutely pathetic. The next day, Alpha noticed. We were sitting at the little cafe down the street, the one with the mismatched mugs and the warm cinnamon smell. I'd been quiet, pushing crumbs around my plate when he finally said, You've been somewhere else lately. Want to tell me where? I forced a smile. Just tired. He studied me for a long moment. You know, I'd rather hear the truth than something that sounds neat. His words landed heavier than he probably intended. I looked down, not trusting myself to meet his eyes. That night, I decided I couldn't keep skirting around the truth. I dialed the number again. It rang twice before the same voice answered. Hello? This time I spoke. Hi, my name is Lily. I think you might have known my grandmother. There was silence on the line, not the kind where someone's distracted, but the kind where they're holding their breath. What was her name? He finally asked. I told him. He exhaled sharply. I didn't think anyone would ever call me about her. Before I could ask more, I heard Alpha's voice in the hallway, calling my name. I panicked again, mumbling, I'll call you back, and ending the call before Michael could answer. Alpha stepped into the room, holding 2 mugs of tea. His eyes flicked to my phone, then back to my face. Who was that? He asked. I swallowed. Just someone from the past. The pause that followed wasn't angry, but it was heavy, like a space where trust should be, and I wasn't sure if I'd just widened the gap between us. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the phone on my nightstand like a weight pulling me into deeper waters. Michael's voice was still in my ears. So was Alpha's. 2 men, one past, one present, and the unsettling feeling that I couldn't hold on to both without something breaking. The next morning I woke before the sun. Alpha was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady, his hand resting loosely against the edge of the blanket. I watched him for a moment, wondering how many more mornings we'd have before the question in my chest tore through the quiet we had built. I slipped out of bed, padded into the kitchen, and made coffee. The steam curled into the dim light, and with it came the restless urge to know more, to stop circling the truth like a wary bird. I picked up my phone and called Michael. He answered quickly this time. Lily. It startled me how he remembered my voice after such a short and awkward first attempt. I'm sorry about last night, I said. I wasn't ready to talk, but I am now. There was a pause, then a low chuckle that wasn't quite humor. I've been ready for decades. He asked if I could meet him that afternoon. I hesitated. Alpha and I had plans. But something in Michael's tone told me that waiting would only let the years pile on top of the truth. We met at a park on the far side of town. He was older than I imagined, but his eyes held a history so deep, it felt like I was looking into a story I hadn't been given permission to read yet. You look like her, he said as soon as I sat down. My grandmother? He nodded. Same way of holding your head when you're thinking. Same stubborn mouth. He smiled faintly, but it didn't last. I loved her once. We loved each other, but life... He trailed off, shaking his head. He told me about stolen afternoons by the lake, letters hidden under loose floorboards, and promises they both wanted to keep but couldn't. My grandmother had been engaged to someone else. Michael had been set to leave for work overseas. They thought they'd have time to fix everything, but time, he said the word like it was an enemy, had other plans. I listened, my hands wrapped around the coffee he'd bought me, the warmth grounding me as his story pulled me backward through decades. She wrote to you, I said, but she never sent them. Michael's eyes glistened. I know. I found out years later. She probably thought it was kinder to let me believe she'd moved on. When we parted, he placed a hand on my shoulder. Lily, whatever you're holding back from the man in your life, don't wait until it's too late. The words stayed with me all the way home. Alpha was on the porch when I returned, leaning against the railing, arms crossed. He didn't look angry, but he didn't smile either. Long day? He asked. I wanted to tell him everything. About Michael, about my grandmother, about the fear that history might be circling back to me. But the words tangled in my throat. Yeah, I said instead. Just a lot to think about. His eyes searched mine like he could read the things I wasn't saying. Then think out loud, Lily. With me. And just like that, I felt the weight of two truths. One from the past, one from the present, pressing against each other, waiting to see which one I'd choose to let breathe first. I didn't tell Alpha about Michael that night. I told myself it was because I needed time to process. But deep down, I knew it was because I didn't know how. The moment I mentioned another man connected to my grandmother's past, it would stop being my private discovery and become our shared burden. The next few days felt off. Not in the dramatic shouting match way movies show, but in small, quiet ways, the kind that erode trust faster than anyone realizes. Alpha didn't stop calling or texting, but the rhythm of our conversations shifted. He would ask, "How's your day?" And I'd give a one-line answer, then quickly change the subject. One evening, he came over with takeout. I was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through my grandmother's old journal like it might hand me the right words. He placed the food down, then leaned against the counter, watching me. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said, "even when you're here." I laughed softly, more out of nerves than humor. That's dramatic. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing against the nightstand. It was barely 6 a.m., the sky outside still heavy with that pale blue light before sunrise. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamt it, until it buzzed again. The number was unfamiliar. I sat up slowly, my heart beating too hard for that early in the morning. I almost let it go to voicemail, but my thumb moved before I could think. "Hello?" My voice came out rough with sleep. There was a pause, just long enough to make me wonder if the call had dropped. And then a man's voice. Deep, steady. "Is this Lily?" "Yes. Who's this?" Another pause, and then almost reluctantly, "My name is Michael." The sound of it made the air in my room feel heavier. I didn't say anything at first, because the name didn't belong to me. It belonged to a stack of letters on my table and a photograph I couldn't stop staring at. He cleared his throat. "I was told you have something of mine, or rather, something that was meant for me a long time ago." My grip tightened on the phone. "Who told you that?" "That's not important right now," he said gently, though his voice carried something that felt like both hesitation and urgency. "But if it's true, I'd like to meet you. Soon." I glanced toward the living room, as if I could see the box of letters from where I sat. My mouth felt dry. "Why now?" I asked. Another pause, this one longer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Because I don't have much time." The line went dead before I could ask what he meant. I stared at the screen, his number still glowing there. My hands felt cold. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't going to be just a conversation about the past. This was going to change everything. By the time I met Alpha at the little coffee shop near the park, the rain had stopped, but the air was still damp and cool. I had barely slept, and I knew it showed in the way I kept fidgeting with the edge of my sleeve. He noticed. "What's going on?" he asked as soon as we sat down. I told him. Every word, the early morning call, the sound of Michael's voice, the strange urgency in his tone. And that last sentence, "I don't have much time." Alpha didn't speak right away. He stirred his coffee, watching the dark liquid spin in slow circles. "And you're thinking of meeting him," he finally said, It wasn't a question. I'm not sure, I admitted. But if my grandmother cared for him enough to write those letters, don't I owe it to her to find out the rest of the story? He leaned back in his chair, his eyes on me. Or maybe you owe it to yourself to protect your peace, he said. Lily, this man is a stranger, and you have no idea why he's coming forward now. I felt my chest tighten. But I can't just ignore it. Alpha's jaw shifted slightly, a tell that he was holding something back. Sometimes knowing more doesn't bring closure, it just gives you more questions you can't answer. His words were careful, but there was something in his tone, something almost protective, that made me feel both grateful and frustrated. I'm not saying you shouldn't go, he added after a beat. I'm saying, if you do, I want you to be ready for the fact that what you hear might not be what you want to hear. I stared into my coffee. Steam rose between us, curling in the air before fading away. That's the problem, I said quietly. I don't even know what I want to hear. We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. When Alpha finally spoke again, his voice was softer. Whatever you decide, I'll be here. It should have comforted me, and maybe it did, in some small way. But as I walked home later, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever choice I made, it was going to pull me, and maybe us, into something neither of us could predict. I didn't call Michael back right away. For 2 days, I carried my phone like it was made of glass, half afraid it might ring again, half hoping it would. The number sat in my recent calls list, and every so often, I'd scroll to it and just stare. It felt like one tap could send me tumbling into a different version of my life, one where I knew the truth. By the 3rd day, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I texted him, I can meet, when and where. The reply came in under a minute. Tomorrow, noon, the old pier. I'll be wearing a gray coat. The old pier was a good 20-minute walk from my grandmother's house, a place I'd been only a handful of times as a child. I remembered it as weathered and quiet, the woods soft underfoot from years of saltwater air. The next morning, I woke early. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I meant to, trying to decide if my jacket made me look approachable or nervous. Eventually, I left without breakfast, tucking the small key from my grandmother's box into my pocket. I didn't even know why I was bringing it. Maybe for courage. Halfway there, I realized I was walking faster than usual. My mind kept replaying that phone call, his voice, the weight of his words. I don't have much time. By the time the pier came into view, the sun was hidden behind a low bank of clouds, and the wind coming off the water stung my cheeks. I spotted a man in a gray coat at the far end. I slowed. My palms were damp. Each step sounded louder on the wooden boards. He was facing the water, shoulders hunched slightly. I opened my mouth to call out, "Lily?" The voice came from behind me. I turned. It wasn't Michael, it was Alpha. He looked out of breath, as if he'd been searching for me. "You can't just meet someone like this without telling me," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I did tell you," I said, my pulse quickening for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. "You told me you were thinking about it," he corrected. "That's not the same thing." I glanced past him toward the man in the gray coat, but he was gone. The end of the pier was empty. "Where?" I started, but the words caught in my throat. Alpha's gaze softened, but he didn't step closer. "If he wants to meet you, he will again. But at least let me be there next time." I stood there, the wind whipping at my hair, feeling caught between two currents, one pulling me toward the past and the other holding me in the present. Somewhere inside, I knew I'd just missed something important. For the rest of that day, I couldn't stop replaying the image in my head. The man in the gray coat standing at the edge of the pier, the wind tugging at his collar. And then he was gone. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that it had been him. Michael. He'd been right there, only a few steps away, and I'd lost the chance. That night, I kept glancing at my phone on the nightstand, half expecting it to light up. It didn't. Not until almost midnight. The screen glowed in the dark, startling me. Unknown number. I hesitated, then swiped. Lily? The voice was quiet, raspy, like it had been pulled through years of silence. Michael? A long pause. I saw you today. My heart pounded. Why didn't you? I couldn't. Not yet. Another pause. There's something I need you to know before we meet, but I can't say it over the phone. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Then tell me where and when, he exhaled. 2 nights from now, 8 p.m., the bench by the old lighthouse. I swallowed. The lighthouse sat on a bluff overlooking the water, a place I hadn't been to in years. Fine, I'll be there. Before I could ask anything else, he said almost urgently, Lily, don't bring anyone this time, especially not him. I froze. What do you mean? But the line had already gone dead. I sat there staring at the phone, my thoughts tumbling over one another. The only him he could be talking about was Alpha, which meant Michael knew more about my life than he should. The next day, Alpha called, his voice warm and unsuspecting. Hey, I was thinking maybe we could take a walk tonight. And I lied. I'm busy. Because for the first time since we met, I wasn't sure if telling Alpha everything was the right thing to do. 2 nights later, I stood at the edge of the lighthouse grounds. The bench was just ahead, framed by the glow of the beacon that swept the darkness in slow, steady arcs. The wind carried the sound of waves crashing far below. I took a step forward and froze. Someone was already sitting there. It wasn't Michael. It was Alpha. The beam from the lighthouse swept over the bench, catching on the sharp line of Alpha's jaw. He was sitting forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. His coat collar was turned up against the cold, but I could still see the tight set of his mouth. My first instinct was to turn around and walk away before he saw me, but his eyes found mine almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for that exact moment. Lily, he said, standing. What are you doing here? My voice came out sharper than I intended. I could ask you the same thing. I crossed my arms. You followed me? I came because I don't trust this guy, he said, his tone controlled but firm. And apparently he doesn't trust me either. The wind whipped between us, cold and biting. So you heard. His gaze didn't waver. He called you again, didn't he? I hesitated. My silence was enough of an answer. Lily, he said, softer now, whatever this man has to say, you shouldn't hear it alone. Before I could respond, a shadow moved in the periphery of the lighthouse's glow. Someone was walking toward us from the path that wound down from the bluff. Alpha saw him at the same moment I did. He stepped slightly in front of me, as if by instinct. The man came closer, the crunch of gravel under his shoes loud in the stillness. Michael? I called, my voice catching on the name. The man stopped just short of the light's reach. I couldn't make out his face, only the shape of him, tall, lean, wearing the same gray coat from the pier. But when he spoke, it wasn't to me. It was to Alpha. I didn't think I'd have to see you again. I felt my stomach drop. Alpha didn't move, didn't speak. The silence between them was so thick I could almost hear the pulse in my ears. I opened my mouth to demand answers. And the lighthouse light swept over Michael's face for the first time. The recognition in Alpha's eyes was immediate. And it was something dangerously close to hate. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and wet earth from the cliff's edge. My heartbeat felt too loud, as if the whole night could hear it. Alpha and Michael stood facing each other, the glow from the lighthouse sliding over their features in slow, deliberate sweeps. Neither moved. I looked from one to the other, my breath clouding in the air. Do you two know each other? Alpha didn't answer, His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitch. Michael's eyes, however, stayed fixed on Alpha. Cold, assessing, almost amused. "We've met," he said finally. The words were simple, but something in the way he said them sent a shiver down my spine. Alpha took a step forward. "You don't belong here, Michael." Michael tilted his head slightly. "Funny, that's exactly what I was going to say to you." I glanced between them, frustration bubbling in my chest. Would someone please tell me what's going on? Neither man looked at me. "Does she know?" Michael asked, his voice low but cutting. "Don't," Alpha warned. Michael's lips curved, not into a smile but something sharper. "So she doesn't." That was enough. "Doesn't know what?" I demanded, my voice rising despite the cold. The lighthouse light passed over Michael's face again, and I caught the faint glint of something like pity in his eyes. "Ask him, Lily. He's the one who owes you the truth." Alpha's expression didn't change, but the set of his shoulders tightened. "This isn't the time or the place." Michael stepped back into the shadows. "Then make the time, because sooner or later she's going to find out. And when she does..." He let the sentence hang, the unspoken ending heavier than the waves crashing below. The beam swept past, and he was gone, swallowed by the dark path leading down the bluff. I turned to Alpha, my pulse still racing. What is he talking about? For a moment I thought he might actually tell me. His eyes softened just slightly, and I could almost feel the words sitting on the edge of his tongue. But instead he said, "You have to trust me, Lily." And for the first time since I met him, I wasn't sure I could. The next morning, the sky was a dull, unbroken gray, the kind that made it impossible to tell what time it really was. I sat at my kitchen table, my untouched cup of tea cooling in front of me. Alpha's words from the night before, "You have to trust me," kept circling in my head like a tide I couldn't push back. Part of me wanted to believe him without question. That was the part that remembered his quiet patience, the way he noticed little things about me no one else ever had. But another part, the part Michael's warning had sharpened like glass, whispered that trust without truth was just another way of walking blind. I'd texted Alpha once, a simple, "Can we talk today?" But the message sat there unread. Maybe he was busy, or maybe he knew exactly what I was going to ask and didn't want to answer. I got up, paced the length of the small kitchen, and sat down again. Michael had been right about one thing. Sooner or later I would find out. And I hated the idea of that truth finding me when I was least prepared. I thought about the way Alpha had stepped in front of me at the lighthouse, protective without hesitation. And then I thought about the look in his eyes when he saw Michael. The recognition, the anger. Those two truths didn't fit together neatly. By noon, I still hadn't heard from Alpha. That's when my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. "If you want answers, meet me where the letters began." No name, no time. Just that. My breath caught. The only place that fit was my grandmother's attic, where I'd found the box of unsent letters. But how would anyone know about that? I stared at the message for a long time. Going there could mean walking straight into a trap. But staying home could mean letting the truth slip further away. I picked up my coat and keys before I could talk myself out of it. As I locked the door, a thought came to me, sharp and unwelcome. What if Alpha was keeping something from me, not because it would hurt me, but because it would change everything between us? The attic smelled exactly as it had the day I first found the box, like cedar, dust, and something faintly sweet, almost floral. The light from the single window was thin and watery, pooling across the old floorboards, like it was afraid to reach too far inside. I shut the door behind me, and the latch clicked louder than I expected. The box was still there, tucked under the old rocking chair. But something was different. The stack of unsent letters inside wasn't neat anymore. The envelopes were scattered, some face down, some bent, as if someone had gone through them in a hurry. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as I picked up the top envelope. It wasn't one I recognized. The handwriting was the same delicate script as the others, but this one had my name on it. My stomach dropped. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out from behind the dusty wardrobe or from the shadowed corner by the window. The attic was silent, too silent. I tore open the envelope, my breath shallow. Lily, you don't know me, but I knew your grandmother, and I know the truth about Alpha. If you want to hear it, you'll need to decide who you believe before it's too late. No signature. My pulse was in my throat. Whoever wrote this knew about Alpha and knew I was here today. The floorboard behind me creaked. I spun around. A man stood in the doorway of the attic. Not Alpha, not Michael, someone I had never seen before. He smiled, just barely, like he already knew the question I was about to ask. Your grandmother wanted you to know the whole story, he said quietly. But she also wanted you to understand. It comes with a cost. The sound of it in her mouth was unsettling, familiar and foreign all at once. I glanced at Alpha, then at Michael, but neither spoke. Both of them stood like soldiers waiting for orders they weren't sure they wanted to follow. You don't know me, she continued, stepping closer, but I knew your grandmother better than almost anyone, and I know why she never sent those letters. Her words landed like stones in my stomach. It wasn't just the fact that she knew about the letters. It was the certainty in her voice, the way she spoke, like she'd been expecting this meeting for a long time. The stranger from before didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched her, his jaw tightening slightly. Alpha shifted his weight, his shoulders squaring, like he was preparing for a fight without raising his fists. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. Not what I want, she said. What you're willing to give. Her eyes narrowed. The truth will cost you, Lily, and once you have it, there's no going back. Michael finally spoke, his tone low but firm. She doesn't have to decide now. The woman didn't even glance at him. She does. Tonight. This is the last time all of us will be in the same room. The air was thick, heavy, the kind of silence that made my own heartbeat sound too loud. I thought about the letters, about Alpha's guarded looks, about Michael's sudden reappearance in my life. I thought about the stranger's warning, trust, and survival. And now this woman was telling me that waiting wasn't an option. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them that if they really cared about me, they'd stop speaking in riddles. But some part of me understood. Maybe if I demanded the truth, I'd hear something I couldn't unhear. The woman stepped closer, just enough that I could see the faint lines around her eyes, the weariness that even the rain couldn't wash away. You have a choice, she said. You can walk out of here and keep living your life without ever knowing, or you can stay and find out exactly why your grandmother's love story never ended. Alpha's eyes met mine, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something that looked almost like fear. Michael stayed by the wall, unreadable. The stranger finally moved, crossing his arms as though bracing for impact. And me? I just stood there, the words caught in my throat, knowing that whatever I said next would change everything. I opened my mouth, and the lights went out. The attic plunged into blackness. For a moment, I thought it was just my eyes adjusting, but then the sound of rain grew louder, almost swallowing the sharp intake of breath I heard from somewhere near the door. Don't move! Alpha's voice cut through the dark, calm but firm. Somewhere to my right, the floorboards creaked. I turned my head toward the sound. Who's there? My voice felt too loud in the dark. No answer. Then, a faint shuffle, followed by the unmistakable sound of the attic door creaking open. Close it, Michael snapped. No one leaves until... But before he could finish, the door slammed shut. The sound reverberated through the wooden beams above us, and for a split second, I could swear I heard the lock click. The woman's voice floated out of the darkness. "This isn't me." Something in her tone told me she was telling the truth. "Then who?" Alpha demanded. I swallowed hard, my eyes straining for any scrap of light, but the dark was absolute. The kind that pressed against your skin, made your senses scramble. And then, closer than I expected, the stranger spoke. "This is how it started last time." My heart stumbled in my chest. "Last time? What last time?" No one answered me. Instead, the floor groaned again, heavier this time, like someone was crossing the room toward me. I took a step back, my heel hitting the base of an old trunk. My fingers found the rusted metal latch. "Lily," Alpha said quietly, his voice coming from somewhere to my left now. "Don't open that." The fact that he knew exactly what I was about to do made the air between us feel charged, dangerous. "Why not?" I asked. "Because," he said, pausing just long enough for the rain to fill the gap, "if you do, you'll know more than you want to." A sudden flash of lightning spilled through the small attic window, just for a heartbeat. In that brief light, I saw it. The woman standing very still, her eyes on me. Michael turned toward the door, Alpha closer than I thought, and the stranger's hand reaching out, almost touching my shoulder. Then darkness again. Somewhere in that black, someone whispered my name, so close it made my skin prickle. "Lily." And then, nothing. The light came back with a sudden angry flicker, the kind that made the shadows jump before settling. For a second, none of us moved. Then my eyes darted around the attic. The woman was still there, pressed against the wall, her chest rising and falling quickly. Michael stood by the door, his hand hovering over the knob. Alpha was 2 steps in front of me, still between me and the stranger, but the stranger was gone. "What just happened?" I asked, my voice sounding thin even to me. Alpha turned slowly, scanning the empty corner where the stranger had been. "He was right here," he muttered, almost to himself. Michael's jaw was set tight. "And now he isn't, which means one of 2 things." "Don't!" the woman cut in sharply, her eyes darting toward me. "Not in front of her." That stung. "In front of me? I'm standing right here. This is about my grandmother, about those letters, about me. So if you have something to say, say it." Michael hesitated, then stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Lily, some stories aren't meant to be told in full. Not because they're too dark, but because once you know them, they live inside you. They change you." I wanted to argue, but Alpha's eyes caught mine, steady and almost pleading. "He's telling the truth. This isn't something you can unknow." I folded my arms. "You all keep talking like I've got this fragile heart you need to protect, but I've already seen enough to know there's something you're not saying. And if you think I'm just going to walk away..." The woman stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Your grandmother thought the same thing. And the choice she made..." She stopped, shaking her head. "It cost her everything." The room fell silent, the rain outside slowing to a soft patter. Finally, Alpha broke it. "We need to leave the attic, now." I glanced once more at the empty corner where the stranger had stood, and a thought I couldn't shake took root. Maybe he hadn't left at all. We left the attic in a line, Alpha first, then me, with Michael bringing up the rear. The narrow stairs groaned under our weight, each step making the air feel heavier. The rain had stopped, but the house held that damp afterstorm smell, wood and dust, and something faintly metallic. Halfway down, I glanced over my shoulder. The attic door was still ajar. "Didn't you close it?" I asked Michael. "I did," he replied without looking back. I frowned. "No, you didn't. It's wide open." "I closed it, Lily." His voice was flat, certain. When I looked again, the door was shut. We stepped into the hallway. The shadows seemed longer here, stretched and strange, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Alpha moved quickly toward the kitchen, motioning for me to follow. "We'll talk downstairs." I trailed after him, but I couldn't shake the feeling of weight behind me. The faintest shift of the air, like someone was walking just close enough to touch my shoulder, but never quite doing it. In the kitchen, the old clock ticked loud and steady. Alpha leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "We need to make a plan. Whatever just happened up there." A soft thump upstairs cut him off. Michael froze. "You heard that, right?" I nodded. "It came from the attic." Alpha shook his head. "No one's up there." But Michael was already moving toward the hallway. Then what made the noise? I stayed where I was, my eyes drifting toward the ceiling. The sound had been small, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight. And then I saw it. The light fixture above the table swayed just slightly, as though someone had brushed past it. I whispered before I could stop myself. "We didn't come down alone." Michael didn't even glance at me when he turned toward the staircase. His steps were sharp and quick, his hand brushing the banister as if the wood itself could pull him up faster. He didn't speak, didn't look back, and didn't wait for me to ask the dozen questions burning my tongue. Alpha lingered in the doorway a moment longer, his gaze flicking from me to the top of the stairs. The look he gave me wasn't a request. It was an unspoken instruction. Stay put. We both knew I wouldn't. He exhaled through his nose, a sound that carried equal parts patience and resignation, then turned and followed Michael up into the shadowed stairwell. The two of them vanished into the muted dark, leaving me alone. The silence that filled the room wasn't the soft, idle kind that comes after a conversation. It had weight. The kind of quiet that presses in on your skin, makes your heartbeat feel louder than it should. My eyes flicked toward the windows. The rain had stopped. When? I hadn't even noticed the moment it faded. Somewhere deep in the house, the clock began to assert itself into the silence. Tick, tick, tick. Each second felt slightly heavier than the last, like the air was thickening around me. I shifted against the doorway, the wooden frame cold against my arm. The air smelled faintly of dust and something older, not just age, but neglect. My ears strained for the creak of floorboards upstairs, for voices muffled through ceiling beams. Nothing. Instead, my mind began inventing sounds. A faint shuffle that might have been the house settling. A breath that could have been mine, or not. The imagined shapes came next. Movements at the corner of my vision that disappeared when I turned my head. The stillness made me restless. My hand twitched toward the stairs, but before I could take a step, the floor above gave a single heavy groan. Footsteps. 2 sets. Slow this time. Alpha emerged first from the stairwell, his posture taut, scanning the room like someone checking for invisible tripwires. His eyes caught mine, and something in them said, "Don't speak yet." Michael followed behind, and in his right hand, he carried something flat and square. He didn't treat it carelessly, but neither did he hold it like something fragile. His fingers pressed firmly to the edges, keeping it steady. He crossed the room and sat at the kitchen table without a word, placing the object down with a soft, deliberate slap. It was a photograph. The image had been handled too many times, the edges curled inward, and thin fractures spiderwebbed across its glossy surface. Still, the people in the picture were clear enough to make my breath catch. My grandmother. She looked younger here, maybe mid-30s. Her hair was swept back from her face, and she wore a dress that felt foreign to every memory I had of her. Tailored, elegant, almost romantic. Her smile was small but warm, her eyes carrying a brightness I'd never seen in the faded family portraits in the house. Beside her stood a man. He wasn't touching her in a way that felt intimate, yet his arm rested across her shoulders with the kind of ease that spoke of familiarity and protection. His face wasn't soft. It was carved in lines that told of a man used to being listened to. He wasn't smiling. His gaze into the camera was unflinching, deliberate, almost challenging. Something about him clawed at my memory, not as a concrete recollection, but as a feeling, like I'd seen him before in the corner of a dream I could never quite hold on to. My voice was low, almost careful. "Where did you find this?" Michael's jaw worked for a second before he answered. "Middle of the attic floor, just sitting there, and no, it wasn't there earlier." Alpha leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the back of a chair. "Which means it wasn't left by accident." I reached for the photograph but stopped just short of touching it. There was a strange reluctance in me, like taking it into my hands would pull me deeper into something I wasn't sure I wanted to enter. When I finally flipped it over, the hesitation turned into something colder. 3 words, written in neat slanted ink, "Not your story." A slow, unpleasant chill crawled up my spine. What does that even mean? Michael didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on mine like he was trying to decide if he could tell me the truth. Alpha's voice broke the silence. "It means someone wants you to believe you're chasing the wrong trail, that you don't belong in this." The words scraped at something inside me. Not my story? Then why did it feel like it had been waiting for me all this time? I slid the photograph back across the table toward Michael. Neither of them moved to pick it up. The shadows in the corners of the kitchen seemed to lengthen, as if the light had dimmed without my noticing. I told myself it was just the shift in the clouds outside. Then, from upstairs, the attic door creaked. None of us had been back up there. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a knife through still water, that slow, deliberate creak of the attic door swinging open. I froze in place, my hands flat on the table, eyes darting to Alpha. His head had already turned toward the ceiling, his body shifting forward like a predator catching a scent. Michael didn't move, but his fingers curled into fists, the photograph still lying between us like an accusation. For a few seconds, no one breathed. The creak stopped, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind that made you certain you weren't alone. "I locked it," Michael said finally, his voice quiet but certain. "After I found the photo, I locked the attic door." "Locks don't matter," Alpha replied, the words clipped. That should have scared me. Maybe it did. But another thought was already clawing its way into my mind. If someone had been up there, waiting, then that meant they had been watching. The idea slid under my skin and stayed there. We moved together, though not in any hurry. Slow steps toward the stairs, like we were all afraid speed might invite whatever was waiting. Alpha took the lead, Michael behind him, and I followed, my eyes fixed on the shadowed landing above. The attic door was open just enough for darkness to spill out. The faint scent of dust and something sharper, metal, drifted down to meet us. Alpha reached for the door, but before he touched it, a soft flutter came from inside. Paper. Something pale and rectangular slipped through the gap and drifted down the steps, landing just 2 stairs above my feet. I bent to pick it up. The envelope was unmarked except for my name, Lily, written in the same neat, slanted ink as the back of the photograph. No return address, no stamp, just my name. I looked to Alpha, but his expression didn't change. "Open it." Inside was a single card. No photograph this time, no folded pages. Just a short line written dead center, as if the sender wanted every inch of the white space around it to press against the words, "You're invited." Underneath was an address, no city, no postal code, just a street name I didn't recognize, and a house number. At the very bottom, one final line, "Come alone." Michael swore under his breath. Alpha's jaw tightened. I stared at the card, the black ink stark against the white, my mind already trying to picture the place, even though I had never been there. No date, no time, just the invitation. And as I held it, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sender already knew I'd come. I didn't move for a long time. The card was still in my hands, the weight of it far heavier than the paper itself. Alpha stood across from me, his arms folded, his gaze fixed on the invitation, as if staring at it long enough might make it disappear. "I'm going," I said finally. "No," Alpha replied without even blinking. "It says come alone," I reminded him. His jaw tightened. "Exactly why you're not going alone." Something inside me bristled at his certainty. "You don't even know what this is." He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "And you don't know what it's not. That's the problem." Michael watched from the corner, leaning against the doorway like he wasn't sure whether to step in or stay out. His eyes flicked between us, reading the tension in the air. "Alpha." I tried to sound calm, reasonable. What if this is the answer? What if this is the missing piece to the letters? My grandmother, the man in the photograph. What if it's not? His voice cut across mine, sharp, but not cruel. What if it's the piece someone wants you to pick up so they can take everything else away from you? The words hit harder than I expected. For a second, I couldn't speak. I looked back at the card, tracing my finger over the street name. "If I don't go, I'll always wonder. If you go without me," he said, "I'll always regret letting you." That was the thing about Alpha. He didn't just push, he planted his words like anchors so you couldn't move past them without feeling the weight. Michael finally spoke. "If you two are going to argue about it, maybe remember there's no time limit on that card. It doesn't say when she has to come." He was right, but it didn't feel like something I could put away and ignore. The ink felt fresh, urgent. I slipped the card back into its envelope, even though the words were already burned into me. Alpha reached out, his hand brushing mine as he took the envelope away. "We do this together, or not at all." I should have argued. Instead, I just stared at him, at the resolve in his eyes, the edge of something unspoken there. It was the same look that made me trust him, and the same look that made me want to disobey him. That night, as the house fell silent, I lay awake thinking about the address. The words "come alone" echoed in my head like a dare, and before I even realized it, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, Alpha made coffee. I knew it wasn't because he wanted any. He rarely drank it first thing. He was keeping himself in the kitchen so he could keep an eye on me. I stirred sugar into my mug like it was the most normal day in the world. Inside, my thoughts were already miles away, circling that address over and over. He leaned against the counter, watching me. "You're quiet." "I'm just tired." It wasn't a lie, not exactly. I was tired, but not from sleep, from thinking, from planning. Michael came in halfway through breakfast. He greeted us, glanced at the envelope sitting between the salt and pepper shakers, and didn't say a word. Smart man. Alpha still hadn't moved it from last night. Maybe he thought leaving it out would be enough to remind me not to do anything reckless. If only he knew. After breakfast, Alpha announced he had an errand in town. "I'll be back in an hour, 2 at most." I nodded, forcing my face to stay neutral. "All right." He hesitated, like he wanted to say something else, but then just gave me that unreadable look of his and left. The second I heard the truck pull away, my pulse kicked up. I turned to Michael, who was sitting at the table flipping through a newspaper. "You're not going to stop me, are you?" I asked. The air between us thickened with the weight of things unsaid. I glanced at the street, half expecting Alpha's truck to appear in the distance. Nothing. "I didn't come here for games," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't a game," they replied, and for the first time their tone carried something sharp, a warning maybe. "Your grandmother wasn't the only one writing." The words hit me like a sudden gust of cold wind. "What do you mean?" They studied me for a long moment, then reached into the inside pocket of their coat. Slowly, they pulled out a thin bundle wrapped in faded ribbon. The paper was worn, the edges frayed, like it had been handled 100 times. "These," they said, placing the bundle on the table between us. Were never meant to be found, but now they have to be. I stared at them, my pulse quickening. Why now? Their gaze sharpened. Because someone else is looking for them. A sudden heavy silence fell over the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed and a dog barked once, then stopped. I leaned forward. Who? But they didn't answer. Instead, they sat down across from me and rested their hands on the table. You have to decide, they said. Do you want the truth, or do you want to stay safe? And just as I opened my mouth to answer, I heard the low rumble of an engine turning onto the street. Alpha. The rumble of the engine grew louder, its rhythm familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. Alpha's truck rolled into view, the sunlight glinting off the hood as it slowed near the curb. I saw the moment his eyes shifted from me to the figure sitting across the porch table. His brow furrowed. The stranger didn't move, but their gaze flicked briefly toward the approaching truck before returning to me. You have to be careful, they murmured, their voice low enough that only I could hear. About what? I whispered back. But instead of answering, they slid the bundle of letters a fraction closer to me, the ribbon catching on the rough wood. Alpha parked and cut the engine. For a moment, the street was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. Then I heard his door open, the creak of the old hinges carrying across the yard. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Someone else is looking for them, the stranger said, their voice a little louder this time, just enough for Alpha to catch the tail end. I turned my head too quickly. Alpha's pace slowed, his eyes narrowing slightly as he approached the porch. Lily, he called, his tone careful. I stood instinctively placing my hand over the bundle of letters. Hi, Who's this? He asked, glancing between me and the stranger. His voice wasn't hostile, but there was an edge to it. The stranger leaned back in their chair, crossing one leg over the other. Just someone delivering something important. Alpha's gaze shifted to the bundle under my hand. What kind of important? I hesitated, feeling both of them watching me. It's connected to the letters I told you about. His jaw tightened slightly. And you were just out here talking? Before I could answer, the stranger stood, their movements unhurried. I should go. They descended the porch steps, pausing at the bottom to look up at me. Think about what I said. Then they turned and walked away, their dark coats swaying with each step until they disappeared around the corner. Alpha stepped onto the porch, his eyes still on me. Lily, what was that all about? I looked down at the bundle in my hands, the ribbon now warm from my grip. I'm not sure, I said, and that was the truth. I stood frozen for a moment after the stranger disappeared around the corner, still clutching the bundle of letters in my hands. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to open them or never look inside again. Alpha's footsteps came closer, his shadow falling across me. Lily, what's going on? His voice was gentle, but there was a firmness to it that I recognized. I don't know, I said quietly, still staring at the place where the stranger had vanished. They just showed up. His eyes narrowed, his face tight with something I couldn't read. And you didn't think to tell me? I finally looked at him, meeting his gaze. I didn't know what to say. It's complicated. Complicated. His voice was softer now, but the confusion in it was clear. Lily, you're standing here holding something that's connected to your grandmother's past. Something that's been buried for who knows how long. And you didn't think to tell me? I swallowed hard. He had every right to be upset. But there was so much more I wasn't telling him. So much that for some reason I was starting to feel like I couldn't. I didn't know what I was getting into, I whispered. I thought it was just letters. Just old unfinished things. But this... I gestured vaguely at the empty street, at the space where the stranger had been moments ago. It's more than that. And it's not just about my grandmother anymore. Alpha stepped closer, his tone softer but no less insistent. Then tell me what's going on. You don't have to do this alone, you know that, right? I shook my head, taking a step back. I know, I do, but I don't know who to trust, Alpha. I don't even know what this is anymore. The only thing I'm sure of is that whoever sent me that invitation. My breath hitched. They're dangerous. There was a long pause, a heavy silence settling between us as he processed my words. Finally, he took a slow breath, like he was gathering himself. You're not alone, Lily. Whatever this is, we can face it together. But you need to start telling me what's going on. And I mean everything. If you're going to keep things from me now, I'm not sure where we go from here. The weight of his words hit me harder than I expected. I thought I'd been doing okay, keeping control, keeping the mystery alive, but in reality I was losing my grip. I stared at him, my chest tight. I can't tell you everything, not yet. He frowned, a flicker of hurt flashing in his eyes before it disappeared. Lily, you're killing me here. You're holding everything back and I can't be the one in the dark. I know you're trying to protect me, I whispered. But this is bigger than just you and me. I need to find out who's behind this. And I need to do it my way. Alpha's jaw tightened, his face conflicted. I don't like it. I don't like that you're still keeping things from me. But I'll respect your decision. I nodded slowly, but the guilt was already gnawing at me. I just need time, Alpha. I promise. I'll tell you when I'm ready. I let the words hang in the air, heavy and unspoken between us. For a long moment, Alpha didn't say anything. His gaze softened just a little, but there was still that edge, that unspoken frustration he couldn't hide. Finally, he sighed and turned to the door. Just don't make me wait too long, okay? I watched him go inside, his broad shoulders disappearing behind the door as it clicked shut. And in that moment, I knew something. I was already losing him, not to the mystery or the danger that loomed, but to the secrets I was keeping. The door clicked shut behind Alpha, and I stood there in the dim hallway, still holding the envelope. The house was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and uneven. I turned the envelope over in my hands again and again, my thumb brushing over the worn paper. The handwriting, delicate but firm, looked like it belonged to someone who took their time with every word. And the name on the back, it wasn't mine. It wasn't even my grandmother's. I should have gone inside. I should have followed Alpha and tried to smooth things over. But instead, I walked to the kitchen, switched on the small lamp over the counter, and set the envelope down like it was some dangerous thing I didn't want to touch again. I made tea I didn't need, more for the sound and the warmth than for the taste. My thoughts spun in restless loops. Alpha's face when I told him I couldn't share everything yet. It was like I'd put a wall between us and he wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to climb over it. I hated that look. After the tea went cold, I finally sat down and slit the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. The letter was short, barely 4 lines, but it made my stomach knot. Lily, I knew your grandmother well. I knew the man from the letters even better. If you want to understand why those letters were never sent, meet me alone. This will change how you see the story forever. No name, just a date, time, and an address written in a shaky script. I stared at the address. I didn't recognize it, but something about it made the back of my neck prickle. It was across town, near the edge of the old district, a place I'd only driven past but never entered. 100 thoughts fought for space in my head. What if it was a trap? What if this was my only chance to learn the truth? And, most dangerous of all, what if Alpha was right, and keeping this from him would cost me more than I was willing to pay? I heard the faint creak of floorboards from upstairs. Alpha moving around in the guest room. For a moment, I almost went up there. I could picture knocking on his door, telling him everything, letting him carry some of this weight with me. But the image of him shaking his head, telling me not to go, not to meet this stranger, was enough to keep me in my seat. I folded the letter back into the envelope and slid it under the stack of old newspapers on the counter. The rain outside had slowed to a soft patter, but my mind felt louder than ever. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corners seemed sharper somehow. I poured the cold tea down the sink, turned off the lamp, and stood in the dark kitchen for a long moment, just listening. I thought I was alone. But then, just before I headed upstairs, I heard it. A faint, deliberate knock at the back door. I stood for a long moment in the mudroom, the rain whispering outside like a conversation I wasn't part of. The envelope was cold in my hand, slick with water, its paper soft from the downpour. I wanted to wait until morning, until Alpha was here, until I'd convinced myself I could handle whatever was inside. But I couldn't. At the kitchen table, I slid a butter knife under the flap. The paper tore with a sound that felt louder than it should have in the stillness. Inside wasn't a letter at first, it was a photograph. The edges were curled and yellowed, the colors faded, but I could still make out the image. My grandmother, younger than I'd ever seen her in pictures, standing on a boardwalk by the sea. Her smile was the same soft one I knew, but she wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at the man beside her, a man who was unmistakably Alpha. I dropped the photo onto the table, my pulse roaring in my ears. That wasn't possible. Alpha wasn't even alive back then, at least, not in a way that made sense. The man in the picture looked exactly like him, down to the set of his jaw, the curve of his mouth. I flipped the photograph over. In my grandmother's handwriting, faint and blurred, were 4 words, "For when she asks." My hands were shaking now as I reached back into the envelope. There was a letter, folded twice, the ink smudged in places, as if it had been touched too many times. It began simply, "Lily, if you're reading this," then I couldn't explain it myself. The truth about him, about the man who will stand by you one day, is not mine to tell. But you must decide if you can trust him before you love him. The rest of the letter was more fragmented, sentences that seemed half erased, references to the deal they made, and what he doesn't know yet. One line, though, was clear enough to make me grip the edge of the table for balance. He doesn't remember, but if he ever does, he might not forgive you. I read it 3 times, my breath coming fast, before I realized the kitchen light was flickering. Then I heard it, the creak of a floorboard in the hallway. I turned sharply toward the sound, and froze. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps. I stood so still I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. "Alpha!" My voice came out small, like it already knew the answer. No reply. I took a step toward the hallway, the photograph still clutched in one hand, the letter in the other. My bare feet made no sound on the cold tile. The shadows beyond the doorway seemed heavier than they should be, swallowing the dim light from the kitchen. I could make out a shape, tall, broad-shouldered, standing just beyond the threshold. "Who's there?" I tried again, forcing my voice steady. This time the shape moved forward and I felt my breath catch. It was Alpha, but something was wrong. His clothes were damp from the rain, but he hadn't been outside since earlier. His eyes, usually warm, steady, looked almost distant, as if he'd walked in from a dream and wasn't entirely sure where he was. "You shouldn't be up this late," he said, his tone low, but edged with something I couldn't place. I glanced down at the letter in my hand and felt a jolt of panic. I couldn't let him see it. Not yet. "I couldn't sleep," I lied. "What about you?" He hesitated before answering, his gaze dropping to the photograph lying on the table. "Where did you get that?" My fingers twitched, tempted to hide it, but it was too late. His eyes had already locked on it, and for a moment I thought I saw recognition flicker there, quickly smothered. Just something that came in the mail, I said lightly, though my voice betrayed me. Alpha stepped closer, slowly, like someone approaching a wild animal. His gaze didn't leave mine when he spoke next. Lily, I've seen that picture before. The air between us tightened, the walls of the old house suddenly feeling too close. Before I could ask him what he meant, the front door banged open, the wind howling through it. Both of us turned toward the sound, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that we weren't alone. The wind tore through the hallway, rattling the picture frames and slamming the kitchen door against the wall. Alpha moved first, stepping toward the entryway, but I caught his arm without thinking. "Wait," I whispered. The front door swayed on its hinges, the storm outside clawing to get in. Rain pooled on the floorboards in an irregular pattern as though someone had stepped in and stopped. Alpha glanced over his shoulder at me, his jaw tight. "Stay here." I should have listened. Instead, I followed a few steps behind, my bare feet cold against the wet wood. The hallway felt impossibly long, every flash of lightning through the open door casting jagged shadows along the walls. "Hello?" Alpha's voice was louder now, but not inviting. More a challenge. No answer. Only the steady drip of water from somewhere just beyond sight. We reached the doorway, and Alpha braced himself against the frame, peering out into the storm. I leaned just far enough to see past him, and saw nothing but darkness. Nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched was so strong it made the hairs on my neck rise. Alpha stepped onto the porch, scanning the yard. The rain soaked him instantly, but he didn't move back. I hovered in the doorway, clutching the letter behind me like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Then, from somewhere in the yard, a voice carried through the rain, faint, female, and achingly familiar. "Lily, don't trust him." Alpha spun toward the sound, but whoever it was had already melted into the storm. He turned back to me, his face unreadable, water dripping from his hair. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but the truth caught in my throat. The door groaned as Alpha shut it against the wind. The house seemed to inhale again, the howl of the storm muffled to a low, steady roar outside. He stood there for a moment, water pooling at his feet, his eyes fixed on me. I could feel the question in his gaze before he spoke. "You heard it too, didn't you?" I swallowed hard. I don't know what I heard. Alpha's brow creased, a flicker of something, frustration, worry, passing over his face. He shrugged off his wet jacket and draped it over a chair, his movements slower than usual, as though he was working through thoughts he couldn't voice. "You didn't answer me," he said at last. "That voice—" He hesitated. "It knew your name." I tightened my grip on the folded letter behind my back until the paper bent sharply. "I'm not sure," I lied. "The storm, it's easy to imagine things." He tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that made it hard to breathe. "You've never been good at lying, Lily." The air between us thickened. I looked away, focusing instead on the puddle forming beneath the front door. We moved back to the kitchen without another word, the storm still pressing against the windows. Alpha sat at the table, elbows on his knees, watching the shadows sway along the walls. "I've seen this before," he murmured, almost to himself. I froze halfway to the cupboard. "What?" "That feeling," he said, finally lifting his eyes to me. "Like something's already here, just waiting for you to notice it. It's why I came back tonight." I forced a light laugh that sounded nothing like me. "Came back from where?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back, his gaze sliding toward the photograph still on the table. "I went to check on something," he said finally. "Something that's been bothering me since you found that picture." My pulse quickened. "And?" His eyes locked on mine. "And I think there's a part of your grandmother's story that you don't know yet." I felt the letter burning against my palm, the weight of words I hadn't yet read aloud pressing down on me. Every instinct screamed to tell him everything, but something in the voice from the storm kept echoing in my mind. Don't trust him. So I smiled faintly, sat across from him and said, maybe, but it's late. He studied me for a long moment before leaning forward, resting his arms on the table. Lily, just promise me something. What? Whatever happens next, you won't shut me out. The paper in my hand crinkled, but I kept my voice steady. I promise, I said, and knew it was the first promise I'd already broken. The rain had slowed to a soft, steady patter by morning, the kind that seeps into the bones and blurs the edges of time. I lay still beneath my grandmother's old quilt, listening. Alpha was already awake. I heard his footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the creaky floorboards of the hallway. Not the easy, relaxed way he usually walked, but measured, careful. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing even, pretending sleep. Something told me that if he knew I was awake, whatever he was doing would stop. He paused at the doorway to my room. The silence was thick enough to taste. Then, almost soundlessly, he moved on. From my bed, I could hear him in the living room, drawers opening, papers shifting. A faint click, like a box being opened and closed again. The air in my chest tightened. My mind instantly leapt to the letter I'd hidden under my pillow the night before, its edges still pressing faintly against my shoulder. Was he looking for it? The search moved to the dining room. The clink of porcelain, the scrape of chair legs. I pictured him moving around in the pale light, sifting through the house like it held answers only he could see. Every sound sharpened my heartbeat. The rustle of paper, the muted thud of something being set down too carefully, the faint sigh he let out more than once. Finally, the footsteps grew closer again. I shut my eyes tighter as he stopped just outside my door. There was a hesitation, long enough for me to wonder if he could hear the lie in my breathing. The quilt shifted slightly when he leaned over, his presence warm, heavy in the air. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The next sound I heard was the front door opening. A rush of cool, damp morning air swept in before it closed again. His footsteps faded down the porch steps. I opened my eyes. The house felt emptier than it had in weeks. But it wasn't the emptiness that scared me. It was the fact that I didn't know whether Alpha had found what he was looking for, or if he'd only just begun. The rain had finally stopped, but the clouds still pressed low against the town, dimming the morning into a false dusk. Alpha had been gone for maybe 20 minutes, or 40. I couldn't be sure anymore. Time felt slippery when I had nothing to anchor it. I moved slowly through the house, careful not to disturb anything. Part of me wanted to look through the same places Alpha had, to see if I could guess what he'd been searching for, but I stopped myself. I wasn't ready to find out if he'd taken something. The kettle hissed softly on the stove. I poured hot water over a tea bag, the faint scent of chamomile curling upward. It was the kind of morning that called for quiet, for slow sips and thoughts you didn't say aloud. But my thoughts refused to be quiet. What was Alpha looking for? Why hadn't he told me? I sat at the kitchen table, my tea cooling in front of me, when the sound broke the stillness. 3 gentle knocks on the front door. It wasn't the impatient rap of a stranger selling something, nor the heavy pound of trouble. It was deliberate, soft, as though the person on the other side didn't want to startle me. I opened the door. A woman stood there, no umbrella, her hair damp from the walk in the mist. She looked to be in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a half smile that felt both reassuring and strangely knowing. "Are you Lily?" she asked, her voice warm but low, as though she didn't want the neighbors to hear. "Yes," I said, gripping the edge of the door. "Can I help you?" She glanced past me into the house, then back again. "I used to know your grandmother. A long time ago." Something in her tone made me lean forward. "You knew her well?" "Well enough to know she didn't tell everyone everything," she said. almost like it was a joke, though her eyes stayed serious. The air between us thickened. She took a step closer, lowering her voice even further. I heard you found the letters. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. I hadn't told anyone except Alpha. I don't know what you're talking about, I said quickly. Her half-smile widened, not unkindly, but like she saw right through me. If you say so. But when he comes back, be careful what you give him. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked away, vanishing into the gray morning. I closed the door, my pulse quickening. I didn't know if she meant Alpha. I didn't know if she meant someone else entirely. But one thing was certain. Alpha wasn't the only one looking for something in this house. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, one hand still resting on the edge of the door, as if the stranger's words had nailed me there. Be careful what you give him. My tea had gone cold. My pulse hadn't. The sound of the front gate creaking open jolted me. Footsteps crunched over the damp gravel path, slow but steady. I turned toward the window just in time to see Alpha's silhouette cutting through the mist. Something about the way he walked, unhurried, head slightly down, told me he had no idea anyone else had been here. Or maybe he did, and he was thinking about what to say. I moved quickly, setting the teacup in the sink, forcing my breath to even out. By the time the door opened, I was leaning casually against the counter, though my heart still rattled against my ribs. You're back, I said, the words sounding far too normal for the storm in my head. Alpha smiled faintly, shaking the drizzle from his jacket. I told you I wouldn't be long. He moved to hang his jacket on the chair, glancing briefly at me. Did anything happen while I was gone? The question landed between us like a small, harmless stone, except I could hear the echo of the woman's voice under it. I hesitated just long enough for him to notice. No, I said finally, my voice steady, too steady. Just had some tea. He nodded, as if satisfied, but something in his eyes flickered, quick, unreadable, before he sat down at the table. I found something I think you should see, he said, reaching into his bag. The room seemed to shrink. My breath caught, but before he could pull it out, I heard another sound, faint but clear, from somewhere deep in the house. A single floorboard creaked. I froze. So did Alpha. His hand stopped mid-motion and his eyes locked on mine. We weren't alone. The sound came again, slower this time, like someone shifting their weight on old wood. It wasn't the kind of noise the house made on its own. Alpha's gaze flicked toward the hallway, then back to me. He didn't move. What was that? I whispered. Probably nothing, he said quickly, almost too quickly. His tone was soft, but it pressed against me like a closed door, not inviting me in, not letting me question further. He stood and walked toward the hallway without another word, his steps deliberate, his back straight. I stayed where I was, my hand curled around the counter's edge. Something in the way he moved told me he didn't want me following him, so I didn't. Instead, I walked to the window and stared at the dripping garden. The rain was lighter now, but the mist still blurred the edges of the world. From somewhere deep in the house came the faint sound of a door closing, one I didn't recognize, not the front, not the back. Alpha returned a few minutes later, his expression perfectly calm. Too calm. Must have been the wind, he said, sliding back into his seat as though nothing had happened. I wanted to ask what door, but the words felt like glass in my mouth, sharp, dangerous. I didn't want to cut myself open if I was wrong. Instead, I nodded and took my place across from him. Between us on the table lay the unopened object from his bag. Neither of us reached for it. We both pretended it wasn't there, and in that shared silence, something shifted. A space opening up between us, not big enough to fall into yet, but wide enough for doubt to grow. He poured himself tea. I watched the steam curl upward, wondering if he could smell the faint trace of another presence in the house. or if I was the only one who noticed. And the worst part was, I couldn't tell if I wanted him to notice at all. If you want, in Act 44 we can have Alpha act overly normal the rest of the evening, but Lily catches subtle slips, widening the mistrust, until she starts considering whether to search the house herself while he's asleep. That would really deepen the unease. For the rest of the evening, Alpha wore the kind of calm that felt like a suit, one that didn't quite fit, but he insisted on wearing anyway. He talked about small things, the weather clearing up tomorrow, a book he thought I'd like, a recipe his grandmother used to make. It was all harmless, ordinary, almost too ordinary. But every so often, in the spaces between his words, I noticed little cracks. The way his hand lingered near the edge of the table, as though keeping something out of my reach. The way his eyes flicked toward the hallway whenever the house creaked. The way his smile disappeared the moment he thought I wasn't looking. When I asked him what he'd done in the city earlier that week, he answered without hesitation. But the answer didn't match what he'd told me before. It was small, just a difference in detail, but it lodged in my mind like a splinter. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. After all, I had secrets of my own. Things I hadn't told him about the letters, about the voice in the storm. Maybe this was just me projecting. Maybe. By the time night settled in, the air between us felt lighter on the surface, but heavier underneath. We moved through the evening like we were following an old dance we'd learned without music. Every step familiar, but the rhythm slightly off. When Alpha finally said goodnight and disappeared into the guest room, I stayed at the kitchen table. The rain had stopped completely now, and the silence pressed against the windows like a presence. I thought about the sound I'd heard earlier, the door that shouldn't have been there, and the object still hidden in his bag. Sleep was far away, and suspicion was too close. By midnight, I was already considering something I'd never done before, waiting until he was asleep, then searching the house myself. If I did it, there'd be no going back. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat there unmoving, until I was sure Alpha was asleep. No footsteps, no creaks from his room, just the steady, faint rhythm of his breathing, filtering through the thin walls. My heart thudded faster as I stood and padded barefoot down the hall. The wooden floor felt colder than usual, like the house knew I was doing something it didn't approve of. I reached his door and paused, listening again. Nothing. Not even a shift of blankets. The bag was in the corner of his room. I'd seen him place it there earlier when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It was dark, but the pale light from the moon spilled across the floor, outlining its shape like a spotlight in reverse. I moved closer, my breathing shallow. One hand reached for the zipper. That's when I heard it. Not from Alpha. From the other side of the house. A faint tapping, irregular, like someone brushing their fingers against glass. I froze. The sound came again. Tap. Pause. Tap, tap. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't the wind. I let go of the bag and crept toward the living room. Every shadow felt thicker, every corner darker than I remembered. When I reached the window, there was nothing. No figure outside, no movement. But on the sill, pressed against the glass from the inside, was a folded scrap of paper. It hadn't been there before. My pulse roared in my ears as I reached for it, hesitating just inches away. Behind me, the floor creaked, not from my own weight. I turned. Alpha was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable in the moonlight. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, blocking the doorway, his shadow stretching toward me across the floor. "What are you doing up?" His voice was low, not sharp, but it carried that quiet weight that made every answer dangerous. I turned back toward the window, clutching the folded scrap of paper in my hand before he could see it. "I couldn't sleep," I said, forcing my tone to stay casual. "The storm?" It sounded like someone was outside. He stepped into the room, his bare feet silent on the floorboards. "And you came to check?" "I didn't want to wake you," I replied. He studied me for a moment longer, his eyes lingering not on my face, but on my hands. I shifted my weight, hiding the paper by my side. "What did you see?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, too quickly. His gaze narrowed, and for a heartbeat I thought he would walk right up to me and take the paper. Instead, he glanced at the window, then back at me. "You should get back to bed, Lily. The weather's making you imagine things." It wasn't a suggestion. I nodded, forcing a small smile, and walked past him, the distance between us heavy with all the things we weren't saying. When I reached my room, I closed the door quietly, sat on the bed, and finally opened the paper. The handwriting was hurried, almost desperate. "Don't trust him. He's not who he says he is." And just as I finished reading it, I heard Alpha's footsteps outside my door, stopping, waiting. I didn't breathe until his footsteps moved again, slow and deliberate, fading down the hallway. Even then, I kept perfectly still, the paper clutched so tightly in my hand it felt damp with sweat. The words swirled in my head like a broken record. Don't trust him. He's not who he says he is. I read them again, and again. Each time, the letters seemed to sink deeper into me. Who wrote it? How did it end up on the inside of the window? And, if it was true, then who exactly had I been letting into my life? I slid the note into the hollow space behind the loose floorboard under my bed, the one Alpha didn't know about, and lowered the board back into place. Then I sat in the dark, hugging my knees, listening for any sound from his room. But the night seemed to stretch on endlessly, each tick of the clock pulling me deeper into questions I couldn't yet answer. When the first gray light of dawn seeped into my room, I still hadn't closed my eyes. Somewhere down the hall, I heard his door open. Soft footsteps, moving toward me. And then his voice, calm, almost casual. "Lily, we need to talk." I opened the door just enough to see him standing there. His hair was slightly tousled, his expression unreadable. For a second, I thought I caught something in his eyes. Not anger, not warmth, but calculation. "I've just been sorting through some old things," I replied carefully. I could feel the folded weight of the award letter upstairs, as though it were still in my hands. "Find anything interesting?" He said it too quickly, too smoothly, like he'd rehearsed it. "Not really," I lied. We held each other's gaze for a moment too long, both waiting for the other to blink first. Finally, he smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Good. I was worried you might dig up something confusing." Before I could respond, he stepped past me, heading toward the kitchen as if the conversation had been nothing more than small talk. But I knew better. Because that smile? It wasn't relief. It was warning. I waited until the house settled into its usual nighttime silence, the soft hum of the fridge, the occasional creak in the wooden frame, before slipping out of bed. I hadn't heard his bedroom door open, but when I checked, the room was empty. My pulse kicked up. He was out there. I pulled on my sweater, careful not to let the zipper scrape too loudly, and slid my feet into sneakers without tying them. Every sound in the house felt magnified in the dark. The front door was unlocked. I eased it open just wide enough to slip through, the night air pressing cold against my cheeks. The street was quiet, but ahead, I saw him. Alpha, walking fast, hands in his pockets, head down. I stayed far enough back that I could stop and blend into the shadows whenever he glanced over his shoulder. Each time he did, my breath froze until he turned forward again. He didn't head toward town. Instead, he cut through the old path by the woods, the one that led to the abandoned train depot. The depot had been empty for years. Windows boarded up, roof caving in. Nobody went there at night. Nobody, except him. When he reached the fence, I saw him look around once more before slipping inside through a gap in the boards. And then, just for a moment, a faint light flickered from within. I pressed my back to a tree, my heart hammering. I could go back, pretend I never saw him, or I could follow him inside. The fence boards groaned as I slid through the same gap Alpha had used. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity wrapped around my spine like cold steel, forcing me forward. Inside, the depot smelled of dust, rust, and something faintly sweet, like old paper. The flicker I'd seen earlier came from a lantern sitting on a metal crate in the center of the room. Alpha wasn't alone. A man stood with his back to me, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat. His voice was low, but the room carried every word. "You're running out of time, Alpha," the man said. "Lily's not going to stay in the dark forever." My breath caught in my throat so sharply I nearly choked. Alpha's reply was sharper than I'd ever heard it. "I'm handling it. You don't know her like I do." The man gave a dry laugh. "I know enough. And I know what happens if she finds the rest of those letters." I leaned too far forward, and my sneaker brushed against a loose stone. It clinked loudly against the concrete floor. Alpha's head snapped toward the sound. His eyes swept the shadows, and landed exactly where I was standing. We froze, him in the light, me in the dark, and in that split second I realized there was no way out of this without him knowing exactly how much I'd heard. I stepped backward, deeper into the shadows, my breath barely moving past my lips. The dim lantern light painted Alpha's face in sharp angles, and for a split second, I thought I saw the flicker of something. Recognition, suspicion in his eyes. Then, without a word, he turned away from me, muttered something low to the man I didn't know, and blew out the lantern. Darkness swallowed the yard. The sudden absence of light made the sound of his footsteps louder than it should have been. Slow, measured, deliberate. They crunched over gravel like he was in no hurry to leave, but every step carried weight, as if he was thinking, planning. I slipped out the same gap in the fence, my fingers grazing the rough wood as I steadied myself. The air outside was cool and damp, thick with the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. I walked quickly, trying to put distance between us, but halfway down the alley, the sound of footsteps caught up to me. "Lily," he called. My heart stuttered. I turned, my mind racing through every possible thing I could say, every excuse I could make. But when he stepped into the weak moonlight, his expression was unreadable. Not angry, not smiling, just calm. Too calm. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked lightly, like it was a joke between us. Something in his voice made me wonder if he was testing me. "Something like that," I said, keeping my tone flat, my words clipped. My voice felt tight, brittle. He didn't press. Instead, he fell into step beside me, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He started talking about ordinary things, how the weather felt warmer than yesterday, how he'd had a strange dream about chasing a bus that never stopped, how the neighbor's cat had apparently claimed the old wicker chair on our porch. Each harmless sentence made my skin crawl, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. We walked in silence for a few beats. My eyes kept darting to him, looking for cracks in that easy composure. Every time I thought I saw one, he blinked, and it was gone. The only sound was our shoes against the uneven pavement and the occasional creak of an old sign swinging in the wind. When we reached the house, he stopped at the door and turned the handle slowly, as though he was deliberately buying time. He opened it for me, and in the dim light of the hallway, I caught that same flicker in his eyes again, just enough to let me know that he knew something. He gave a small nod toward the living room. "We should probably talk. Soon," he said softly. Then, without waiting for my reply, he stepped past me and disappeared down the hallway to his room. The quiet he left behind was deafening. I stood there, my hand still on the doorknob, replaying every word, every look. Soon. He'd said soon. I didn't know if that meant tomorrow, next week, or in the next few minutes. I barely slept. Every time my eyes closed, I saw that flicker in Alpha's eyes. It had a weight to it, the kind of knowing that didn't belong to someone guessing. It belonged to someone who had already decided something. By the time the first threads of light slipped through my curtains, my body ached from lying so stiff all night. I finally threw off the blanket and sat up, feeling the cool floorboards under my bare feet. The house was quiet, too quiet, except for the faint ticking of the old wall clock downstairs. I half expected him to be waiting in the kitchen, maybe leaning on the counter, coffee in hand, ready to finish the sentence he'd left dangling last night. But when I stepped into the hallway, it was empty. The air smelled faintly of toast and something sweet, jam maybe, which told me he'd already been up, eaten, and moved on with his morning, as if nothing had happened. I found him in the backyard, crouched over the flower bed, wearing an old sweater I'd never seen before. His hands were buried in the dirt, pulling up weeds with patient, almost meditative movements. "Morning," I said cautiously. He glanced up, smiled faintly, and returned to his work. No mention of soon, no mention of we should talk, nothing. If he'd been anyone else, I might have taken it as mercy, that he'd decided whatever had been on his mind wasn't worth the weight it put on mine. But this was Alpha. He didn't forget things. He stored them. I lingered by the porch rail, watching him. "I didn't hear you come in last night," I said, probing. He kept pulling weeds. "I was tired." "That's it?" I asked. "That's it," he replied with the kind of finality that made me stop pushing. We spent the rest of the morning in a strange rhythm. Me making breakfast, him working outside, both of us moving like actors in a play neither of us had rehearsed. The only sounds were the scrape of a chair, the clink of cutlery, the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. It felt like sitting across from a closed book I wasn't allowed to open. When he finally came inside, he went straight upstairs, without even looking at me. Not cold, not warm, just absent. And the space he left in the room felt bigger than it should have. That's when I realized, maybe soon didn't mean when he was ready. Maybe it meant when I couldn't take the waiting anymore. By midday, the silence had become a living thing in the house. It stretched across every room, curled into the corners, and followed me like a shadow. I told myself I'd wait him out, that if Alpha wanted to talk, he would, but my patience felt like a fraying rope. He was in the study when I found him, leaning over the desk, scribbling something in that small leather notebook he never let me touch. The window was open, letting in a faint breeze that carried the smell of wet leaves. "You've been quiet," I said, standing just inside the doorway. "So have you," he replied without looking up. That should have been my cue to retreat. Instead, I stepped closer. "Are we going to pretend last night didn't happen?" His pen stopped mid-sentence. Slowly he looked up, meeting my eyes with an expression that was too calm, like a lake hiding a strong current. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. "Yes," I said before I could stop myself. He closed the notebook, placed the pen neatly on top, and leaned back in his chair. "Then talk." That single word hit me harder than any accusation. It wasn't an invitation, it was a test. "I saw your face last night," I began. "You wanted to say something, Alpha. I'm not imagining it." "Maybe I did," he said evenly. "And maybe I'm waiting to see if you'll tell me first." I froze. His gaze was steady, searching for something he wasn't going to name out loud. My pulse was loud in my ears. "What exactly do you think I'm hiding?" I asked. "That's the thing," he said. "If I tell you what I think, you'll shape your answer around it. I'd rather hear what you give me unprompted." It was maddening, infuriating. And yet, there was a kind of care in it too. Like he didn't want to trap me, but he needed to know I wouldn't trap myself in a lie. "I'm not hiding anything," I said finally. He held my gaze for several long, punishing seconds before nodding once. "All right." He turned back to his notebook, just like that. Conversation over. But as I stood there, trying to decide whether to push harder or let it drop, he said quietly, almost to himself, "Soon, Lily. Very soon." The rain had returned by afternoon, pattering softly against the windows, like it had no intention of leaving. I sat in the kitchen, turning my mug of tea between my hands, still replaying Alpha's words from earlier. Soon, Lily. Very soon. It didn't feel like a promise. It felt like a warning. I heard the low rumble of the mail truck outside, before the metallic clang of the mailbox shutting. Normally, Alpha fetched the mail. It was one of those unspoken habits we'd fallen into. But today I moved first. I needed the air. Or maybe I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't letting him control the rhythm of my day. The air outside was sharp and damp, carrying the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil. I opened the mailbox and sifted through the usual mix: bills, advertisements, an envelope with no return address. It was thick, sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp. My grandmother's initials were pressed into the red wax. My breath caught. I stood there, staring at it, wondering if he'd meant the storm outside, or the one that had just started between us. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth as I stepped outside. The rain had slowed to a mist, beating on Alpha's jacket as he walked ahead of me, hands buried deep in his pockets. "Where are we going?" I asked, pulling my hood tighter. "You'll see," he called back without turning. We crossed the yard, my shoes sinking slightly into the softened ground, and slipped onto the narrow path that wound into the trees behind the house. This wasn't the way into town. This wasn't the way to anywhere I recognized. "Alpha, I didn't even bring my phone," I said, half expecting him to stop, to turn, to reassure me. He didn't. Branches arched overhead, dripping onto my shoulders. The only sounds were the distant groan of the wind and the wet crunch of our footsteps. "Is this about earlier?" I finally asked. He didn't answer. I sped up until I was beside him. "You've barely said 3 words since we left. Are you going to tell me what's going on, or should I start imagining the worst?" A shadow of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're good at that, imagining the worst." We kept walking until the trees began to thin. Ahead, the outline of a structure emerged through the mist, small, weather-worn, and half-swallowed by creeping ivy. I slowed. "What is this place?" "Somewhere you should see," he said, finally meeting my eyes. And for just a second, I thought I saw something in them, something like regret. We stopped at the edge of the clearing. The building was an old cabin, its roof sagging in the middle, the windows clouded over. Alpha stood still, studying it like a man weighing whether to open a locked box. "You've been here before," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "Once." The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on the cabin's porch. I shivered, not entirely from the cold. "Alpha, why bring me here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots creaking on the warped boards, and placed his hand on the cabin's door. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that I almost missed it. "Because this is where the story really started." The hinges groaned as Alpha pushed the door open. The air that rushed out was stale, tinged with the faint musk of damp wood and something metallic, like coins left in the rain. I hesitated at the threshold, my fingers brushing the edge of the doorframe. "When was the last time anyone was in here?" Alpha didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped inside, his boots thudding softly against the warped floorboards. "Come in, Lily." The light inside was weak, filtering through 2 cracked windows smeared with grime. Dust hung in the air like 1,000 suspended seconds, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The cabin was one room, empty except for a table pushed against the far wall and an old trunk in the corner. Alpha stood beside the trunk, staring at it, like it had been waiting for him. Or maybe for us. "What's in it?" I asked. He crouched, brushing away a mat of cobwebs from the lid. Something I shouldn't have left here. My chest tightened. You've been keeping things from me. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. And you've been keeping things from me. The words hit harder than they should have. He unlatched the trunk. The lid creaked open, revealing stacks of yellowed envelopes, each tied with brittle string. My pulse quickened. They weren't just like the letters I found in my grandmother's attic. They were the same handwriting. Alpha. My voice shook. Why do you have these? He rested his hand on the top bundle. Because they were never meant to be found. And because if you read the wrong one first. He trailed off, his gaze fixed on something deep inside the trunk. What happens if I do? I asked. His eyes met mine, and for the first time all night, there was fear in them. You'll start seeing people differently, including me. I reached out without thinking, my fingertips grazing the coarse twine binding the stack of envelopes together. The paper felt brittle, delicate, like it might turn to dust if I breathed too hard. Alpha's hand closed gently but firmly over mine. Not tonight. I swallowed. Why not? He held my gaze for a long moment, as if weighing whether the truth would help or hurt. Because once you know, there's no unknowing, and I don't want to lose this moment. This moment? I asked, my voice quieter now. The one where you still see me the same way you did yesterday. I froze, my thoughts tangling into questions I couldn't form. Part of me wanted to demand answers. Another part, maybe the braver part, feared what I'd hear. The trunk loomed in the corner like a silent witness, the letters inside carrying the weight of decades. I could feel the words trapped in them, humming like a low current, pressing against the paper, desperate to spill out. Alpha released my hand slowly, almost reluctantly, and straightened up. You can read them, he said. Just, not tonight. I stood there staring at the stack. My fingers itched to undo the knot, to peel back the first flap and spill light on whatever secrets were trapped inside. But something in his tone, something I couldn't name, made me pause. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was almost sorrow. I stepped back. All right, not tonight. Alpha nodded once, a small exhale slipping past his lips, and for a brief moment the tension between us softened. He closed the trunk, the latch clicking shut like a seal over something sacred. We left the cabin in silence, the air outside colder than I remembered, but it wasn't the wind that made me shiver. It was the knowledge that a part of the story was still sitting in that trunk, waiting for me, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to know it. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the trunk, the coarse twine, the brittle paper, and Alpha's voice, low, almost pained, telling me, once you know, there's no unknowing. I lay on my side, staring at the shadows curling along my bedroom wall. The rain had picked up again, pattering against the roof in restless bursts. The room should have felt safe, familiar. Instead, it felt like the walls were leaning in, pressing me toward the one truth I'd promised not to touch. I kept asking myself the same questions. Why didn't he want me to read them now? What could possibly be in those letters that would change how I saw him? A part of me whispered that maybe he was protecting me. Another part, darker and sharper, wondered if he was protecting himself. I tried turning over, pulling the blanket higher. I even counted the sound of the rain like it was a lullaby. But my body stayed tense, my mind alive with images of Alpha standing in the cabin, looking at me with that mixture of longing and warning. By 2:37 a.m., I gave up. I sat up in bed, my hair falling around my face, and stared at my phone. My finger hovered over his name in my contacts. I wanted to call, to hear his voice, to ask, what aren't you telling me? But I didn't. Instead, I sat in the dark, listening to the rain, feeling like the whole night was holding its breath. Because somewhere out there, Alpha was probably awake too. And maybe, just maybe, he was wondering if I'd already broken my promise. The sun came in pale and uncertain, like it wasn't sure if it should bother. I'd finally drifted off sometime after 4, so the sound of my alarm felt cruel, dragging me from a dream I couldn't remember. I dressed slowly, the memory of Alpha's warning still clinging to me like the rain from last night. My reflection in the mirror looked the same as always, but I felt altered. Not in a way I could name, only in a way I could feel. When I stepped outside, the air was cool and damp, still smelling faintly of wet leaves and wood smoke. I spotted Alpha down the road, leaning against his truck, sipping from a paper cup. He looked up at the sound of my footsteps and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a guilty one, just warm, like nothing had happened. "Morning," he said. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Morning," I echoed, forcing my own to match his. We didn't talk about the letters, or the trunk, or the way he'd stopped me last night. We talked about the weather, the coffee in town, the repairs he was making to the cabin roof. It was all so ordinary, and that was the strangest part. At one point, he handed me the coffee he'd been holding for me. Our fingers brushed, just for a second, but it was enough to make my pulse leap. I didn't know if it was because I liked him, or because I didn't know if I could trust him. The morning moved on like a scene we'd both agreed to perform. Smiles, light conversation, a few shared laughs. But underneath it, I could feel the tension coiled tight, waiting. And I had the distinct, unsettling sense that both of us were just buying time. 3 days passed. 3 days of polite smiles, casual conversations, and deliberate silences. I told myself I was fine with it, that whatever Alpha wasn't ready to share could wait. But deep down, I knew I was keeping my hands busy, so my mind wouldn't wander back to that night. On the 4th afternoon, I decided to walk into town. The autumn air had turned crisp, and the maple trees lining the road were beginning to shed their gold. I stopped by the little general store for some tea, half hoping, half dreading that I might run into Alpha. Instead, I ran into Mrs. Carter. She was one of those women who seemed to know every story worth knowing, and a few better left unsaid. We exchanged pleasantries, and I was just about to leave when she lowered her voice. "You've been spending time with Alpha, haven't you?" she asked, her eyes sharp in a way that made me feel suddenly 14 again. I hesitated, but nodded. "We've talked a little." Mrs. Carter tilted her head. "You be careful with him, dear. Charming, yes, but there's a reason some folks don't forget what happened all those years ago." Before I could ask what she meant, she added, almost as an afterthought, "Funny thing, though, his father's name was the same as the man in those old letters your grandmother kept. Isn't that strange?" Her words slid into me like ice water. Alpha's father? The man in the letters. I wanted to ask more, but Mrs. Carter had already moved on to talking about the church bake sale, as if she hadn't just dropped a bomb in the middle of my day. When I finally stepped back into the sunlight, the world felt tilted. I didn't know what I feared more, that she was wrong or that she was right. And for the first time since I met Alpha, I wondered if the reason he'd stopped me that night wasn't to protect me, but to protect himself. I didn't go straight to his house. I walked the long way back from town, hoping the crisp air might cool my thoughts, but every step only fed the fire. Mrs. Carter's words echoed in my mind, linking Alpha to the letters in a way I hadn't dared imagine before. By the time I reached my grandmother's old porch, the sun was sinking low. The golden light spilling across the worn boards did nothing to calm me. My pulse was unsteady, my hands restless. I told myself to wait, to think it through, but my feet had other plans. When Alpha opened his door, he looked surprised. Not the kind of surprise that's all warmth and welcome. No, it was the surprise of someone caught off guard before they've had a chance to hide something. "Lily," he said slowly, his voice neutral. "Everything all right?" I stepped inside without answering, my eyes searching his in the quiet. You knew the man in those letters, didn't you? The silence stretched. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. Finally, he let out a low sigh, running a hand through his hair. Who told you? Does it matter? I asked. Just tell me the truth. Alpha leaned back against the counter, his jaw tight. There are things you don't understand, things that might make you see me differently. I crossed my arms. Maybe I'd rather see you differently than keep wondering if you've been lying to me this whole time. For a moment, I thought he might finally give me a straight answer. His eyes softened, and he opened his mouth. But then, he shook his head. Not yet. Why not? My voice cracked on the question. Because you're afraid I'll walk away? No, he said quietly. Because once you know, you won't be able to walk away, even if you want to. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Alpha, what are you saying? I whispered. He took a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the floor. I'm saying the man in those letters wasn't just part of my past. He's the reason I'm still here, and the reason you might not want to be. Before I could ask more, he glanced toward the window, as if he'd heard something outside, and then, without explanation, he said, You need to go. Now. I left with more questions than I'd arrived with, my heart pounding in my ears. The wind picked up as I walked home, carrying the scent of rain and the taste of something else, something like fear. By the time I reached my grandmother's gate, the night had settled thick and low. The wind rattled the old wind chime by the kitchen window, its uneven notes slicing through the silence. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my mind replaying Alpha's voice, the weight of his words. The reason you might not want to be. I stepped onto the porch, but stopped halfway. Someone had been here. The wicker chair was pushed back at an odd angle, the doormat flipped up like a heel had caught it. And then I saw it, resting neatly on the top step, wrapped in the same pale blue ribbon as the letters I'd found weeks ago. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. It was a small box, no bigger than my hand, the ribbon tied so tightly I had to dig at the knot with my nails. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, edges curling from age. It was Alpha, younger, maybe by a decade, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. The stranger's arm was slung around Alpha's shoulder, but there was something about his eyes, something sharp, almost mocking. And in the corner of the photo, scrawled in faded ink, were 3 words. Don't trust him. The night seemed to breathe around me, and for a moment I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel path. I turned sharply, but saw nothing. Still, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at the photograph, wondering whether the warning was meant for Alpha, or for me. I didn't call ahead. I didn't plan what to say. By mid-morning, I was already walking down the narrow path to Alpha's place, the photograph tucked inside my coat pocket, like it might burn me if I held it too long. He opened the door before I could knock twice. Lily. His eyes flicked over my face like he was scanning for damage. What happened? I pulled the photograph out without a word and placed it in his hand. His fingers froze around it. For a long moment he didn't blink. Then he let out a quiet breath. Where did you get this? On my porch last night, I said, watching every shift in his expression. The air between us felt brittle, like the wrong move would make it crack. He stared at the picture again, his jaw tightening. That man. He trailed off, shaking his head. I haven't seen him in years, decades. Who is he? Alpha's gaze lifted to mine, steady, but shadowed. Someone who used to be my friend. Someone I should have walked away from sooner. That's all you're going to tell me? My voice came out sharper than I meant. There's more, Lily, a lot more. But if I told you right now, you'd... He stopped, swallowing the rest of the sentence. I'd what? I asked, heart pounding. He didn't answer. Instead, he set the photo down on the table and pushed it toward me like it didn't belong in his house. You should keep it, he said quietly. It might help you more than it helps me. I picked it up, but the edges felt heavier than paper. As I turned to leave, Alpha spoke again, so softly I almost missed it. Be careful who you ask about him. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alpha's face the moment he saw the photograph. That flicker of recognition, the hesitation, the way his voice had dropped when he warned me. By morning, my curiosity had grown claws. I wasn't going to get answers from him, not yet, so I'd have to find them myself. I started with the only clue I had, the faded shop sign in the background of the photo. It took me an hour of searching through old local directories at the library before I found it. Carter Sons Tailoring, closed down in 1987. The librarian, Mrs. Hawthorne, was in her 70s and had lived in town all her life. I slid the photo across the desk. Do you know who this is? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Her hand froze halfway to her teacup. She leaned closer, squinting at the man beside Alpha. Then she sat back, shaking her head, but not like she didn't recognize him, more like she wished she didn't. Best leave that alone, Lily, she murmured. Why? Mrs. Hawthorne glanced around the quiet library as though the walls might be listening. Because some names are better left in the past. I pressed her for more, but she refused to say another word. Still, as I gathered my things, she slipped a scrap of paper into my hand. A name, 2 words, and beneath them, an address. When I stepped outside, the sky was darkening with heavy clouds. I stared at the paper, my pulse quickening. I had no idea who this man was yet, but I was starting to understand why Alpha didn't want me to find him. The address Mrs. Hawthorne gave me was on the edge of town, where the streets narrowed into gravel paths and the houses leaned with age. Every step I took down that road felt heavier than the last. When I found the place, my first thought was that it looked abandoned. Curtains drawn, paint peeling, the porch sagging slightly. But there was a light on inside. I hesitated at the gate, the slip of paper crumpled in my hand. I told myself I'd just knock, ask a few questions, and leave. Nothing more. But my pulse was racing like I'd been caught doing something wrong. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. I raised my hand to knock, and the door opened before I could touch it. A man stood there, older, hair streaked with gray. His eyes swept over me once, sharp and assessing, before softening just slightly. You look just like her, he said. I froze. Like who? His gaze didn't waver. Your grandmother. The air between us thickened. I wanted to ask how he knew her, but the way his jaw tightened made me think he already knew why I'd come. Instead, he stepped aside. You'd better come in, Lily. We have a lot to talk about, and not much time. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed 2 things. The faint smell of old books, and the way every picture frame on the wall was turned slightly away from the door, as if shielding its subjects from strangers' eyes. The man gestured to a chair in the corner. Sit. You'll want to. I obeyed, clutching my bag on my lap like it was armor. I'm Daniel, he began, settling into the seat opposite me. Daniel Carter, your grandmother and I, we knew each other a long time ago. The way he said knew sent a ripple through me. Not just acquaintances, not even just friends. Something deeper. But before I could press, he leaned forward. You've read the letters, haven't you? I swallowed. Yes. They weren't meant for you, he said gently. But maybe they found you for a reason. My fingers tightened on the strap of my bag. And what reason would that be? He studied me for a moment, then exhaled slowly. Because the man in those letters isn't just a piece of your grandmother's past. He's the reason Alpha is here. The words crashed into me like cold water. What? I managed to whisper. Daniel didn't look away. Alpha isn't who you think he is. And if you keep pulling at this thread, You're going to unravel more than just a love story. I felt my throat tighten. What are you saying? That I shouldn't trust him? Daniel's eyes softened, but his voice stayed firm. I'm saying, you should be ready for the truth, and once you hear it, you can't unhear it. A loud ticking from the old wall clock filled the silence between us. I didn't know if I was ready, but I also knew it was already too late to turn back.